I heard something strange about my 67-years-old husband, didn't believe it, but decided to watch him. I made it through the service, sang the hymns, shook hands during the peace, even stayed for the potluck lunch. But all I could think about was that word, Louisville. And why everyone seemed to know something about my husband's trips that I didn't. Have you ever felt your world tilt sideways from just a few overheard words? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. If you've ever wondered how far someone would go to erase you from your own life, this story will shake you to your core. I'm talking about a betrayal so calculated, so methodical, that it took decades to complete, and it happened right here in the American heartland, where trust runs as deep as Sunday church attendance. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on your shoulders? Have you ever noticed how quickly conversations stop when you appear, leaving only the echo of your own name hanging in the air? Do you know someone who's lived a double life so convincing that even their spouse of 30 years never suspected? This is the story of a 67-year-old woman who discovered that her husband hadn't just been cheating, he'd been systematically writing her out of existence, one forged document at a time. By the time she found out, she was already legally dead on paper, her inheritance stolen, and her entire life's work transferred to a family she never knew existed. Follow along as we uncover a mystery that's been buried in plain sight, hidden behind church donations and neighborhood barbecues, where the most dangerous predator wore the face of a loving husband. The church ladies stopped talking when I walked into the fellowship hall. That's when I knew the whispers were about me. I'd been coming to First Methodist in Cincinnati for 28 years. Same pew, same time, same coffee cup with the chipped handle that nobody else ever touched. But that Sunday morning in March felt different. The air itself seemed heavier, thick with secrets that everybody knew except me. Mrs. Henderson looked up from arranging the coffee service, her eyes darting away like she'd been caught stealing from the collection plate. Betty Williams actually flinched when our eyes met across the folding tables. These were women I'd prayed with, laughed with, shared casseroles and Christmas cookies with for nearly 3 decades. Now they were treating me like I had some contagious disease. "Morning, ladies," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the knot forming in my stomach. The response was a chorus of uncomfortable hellos and sudden fascination with stirring cream into coffee that was already mixed. I caught fragments of whispered conversation as I moved toward my usual spot near the window. Saw him in Louisville again. That house on Maple Street. Poor thing doesn't know. Louisville. My husband Frank had been taking a lot of business trips to Louisville lately. Hardware conventions, he said. New suppliers for the store. Always came back with stories about boring meetings and bad hotel coffee. Have you ever felt your world tilt sideways from just a few overheard words? That's what happened to me in that fellowship hall, surrounded by people who suddenly couldn't look me in the eye. I made it through the service, sang the hymns, shook hands during the peace, even stayed for the potluck lunch. But all I could think about was that word, Louisville. And why everyone seemed to know something about my husband's trips that I didn't. If your community knew something about your life that you didn't, you'd want warning signs. Subscribe so you never miss them. When I got home that afternoon, Frank was in his recliner reading the Sunday paper, just like always. The house smelled like the pot roast I'd put in the slow cooker before church. Everything looked normal, peaceful, ordinary. But I kept hearing those whispered fragments, kept seeing the way the church ladies had avoided my eyes. "How was church, honey?" he asked without looking up from the sports section. "Fine," I said, hanging my purse on the kitchen hook. Same as always. But it wasn't the same. Nothing would ever be the same again. That night, after Frank had gone to bed, I was straightening up the living room when I noticed it. A manila folder sticking out from under his recliner, just barely visible beneath the worn fabric edge. Frank was always careful with his paperwork, always kept everything filed away in his desk. Seeing that folder lying there, forgotten and exposed, was like finding a crack in a perfect wall. I didn't touch it that night. But I couldn't stop staring at it either. That folder would change everything. Because when I finally worked up the courage to look inside, I discovered that my name wasn't on the tab. Comment red flag if you've ever ignored a warning you should have heeded. I didn't plan to search his desk. The drawer pulled open when I dusted around it, and everything inside had someone else's name. It was Tuesday morning, 2 days after that uncomfortable scene at church. Frank had left early for the hardware store, kissing my forehead and telling me he'd be working late on inventory. The house felt different with him gone, like I could finally breathe without measuring each breath. I was doing my weekly cleaning, same routine I'd followed for years. Dust the living room, vacuum the bedrooms, tackle Frank's home office last because he hated when I moved his papers around. But when I reached across his desk to wipe down the lamp, my cleaning cloth caught the handle of the bottom drawer. It slid open about 2 inches before stopping. Strange. Frank always kept that drawer locked tight. Said it was where he kept important business documents that didn't need to be disturbed. I'd respected that boundary for 30 years, never questioned it, never even been curious enough to try the handle. But there it was, cracked open like a door begging to be pushed. My hand trembled as I pulled it the rest of the way. Inside were hanging folders, each one labeled in Frank's neat handwriting. But these weren't business documents. These were life insurance policies, property deeds, bank account statements, all the papers that make up a person's existence. The first folder I lifted out was labeled Mackenzie Life Insurance. My heart jumped. Mackenzie was my maiden name, the name I'd kept for legal documents even after we married. But when I opened the folder, the beneficiary name made my blood run cold. Carolyn Mackenzie Stewart. Not me. Not Margaret Mackenzie Stewart, the name I'd used for 3 decades. Someone else entirely. The policy was for $500,000. More money than Frank and I had ever discussed. More money than I knew existed in our name. I kept digging through the folders, each one revealing another piece of a puzzle I didn't understand. Property deeds for a house in Lexington, Kentucky, a house I'd never seen, never heard of, but somehow my forged signature was right there on the paperwork as co-owner. Bank statements showing regular transfers to accounts I'd never opened, never authorized, never even knew existed. Thousands of dollars moving every month from our joint checking account to places labeled family support and household expenses, KY. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers. The morning light streaming through the office blinds felt too bright, too harsh, like it was exposing secrets that were meant to stay buried in darkness. But it was the last document that made me sit down hard in Frank's office chair. A marriage certificate. Official state seal, proper signatures, legal witnesses. Dated 3 years ago. The groom's name was Franklin James Stewart. My husband. The bride's name was Carolyn Mackenzie Stewart. Not me. Never me. Someone who'd stolen my maiden name along with my husband. Ever found proof that your life wasn't what you thought it was? The bank statement showed $1,200 missing. When I asked him about it, he kissed my forehead and said I was getting forgetful. I spent the rest of that Tuesday sitting at our kitchen table with every bank statement I could find from the past 2 years, a calculator, and a growing sense that I'd been living with a stranger. The numbers told a story I'd been too trusting to read. Monthly withdrawals of $800 labeled business expenses. Weekly transfers of $300 marked emergency fund. Cash withdrawals every Friday for amounts that varied but always ended in round numbers, $150, $200, $250. Money flowing out of our accounts like water through a cracked dam, and I'd never noticed because Frank handled all the finances. You don't need to worry your pretty head about money matters, he'd always said. That's what husbands are for. I'd believed him. 30 years of believing that his gentle condescension was really protection, that his need to control our financial life was just old-fashioned caring. Now I could see it for what it really was, the systematic theft of my own money, right under my nose. When Frank came home that evening, I was waiting at the kitchen table with the statements spread out like evidence in a trial. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say, how I was going to ask the questions that needed asking. But when he walked through that door, looking tired and ordinary and familiar, all my carefully planned words dried up. "Hey there, beautiful," he said, kissing the top of my head like he'd done thousands of times before. How was your day? Fine, I managed. Then, gathering courage from somewhere deep inside, Frank, I was looking at our bank statements today. Can you explain this $1,200 withdrawal from last month? He paused, his hand still resting on my shoulder. I felt his fingers tighten slightly, then relax. When he came around to face me, his expression was patient, almost amused. Oh, honey, he said, settling into the chair across from me with that gentle smile I'd fallen in love with 40 years ago. You're getting a little forgetful, aren't you? That was for the new inventory system at the store. Remember? I told you all about it over dinner last Tuesday. But I hadn't forgotten. I remembered that dinner perfectly. We'd talked about my sister's hip surgery and the weather forecast for the weekend. Nothing about inventory systems or $1,200 withdrawals. I don't remember that conversation, I said carefully. Financial betrayal creeps in quietly, then strikes fast. Subscribe to recognize the early signs. Frank leaned across the table and took my hands in his, the same hands that had held me during my father's funeral, that had built our first kitchen table, that had apparently been forging my signature for years. Margaret, sweetheart, you've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe you should talk to Dr. Peterson about your memory. These little lapses. My memory is fine, I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. He blinked, clearly not expecting pushback. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face, annoyance, maybe, or calculation. Then the gentle smile was back. Of course it is, dear. I'm just worried about you. That night, after he'd gone to bed, I started photocopying everything. Every receipt, every statement, every signature that didn't look quite right. Because if Frank was making me question my own memory, I was going to need proof of what was real. What would you do if someone gaslit you about your own money? His phone rang during dinner. Louisville business, he said, but I heard a woman's voice saying, "Honey, when are you coming home?" We were eating my Tuesday night special, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans from the garden I'd been tending for 28 years. Frank had been telling me about some problem with a supplier, how he might need to drive down to Louisville again this weekend to straighten things out. Seems like you're going to Louisville a lot lately, I said, cutting into my meatloaf. Must be some pretty complicated business. You know how it is with vendors, he replied, not meeting my eyes. Sometimes you have to handle things face to face. That's when his cell phone started buzzing on the table between us. Frank glanced at the screen and his whole body went still. I could see the tension creep up his neck, the way his jaw tightened just slightly. Sorry, honey, I need to take this. Business. He stepped into the living room, but our house wasn't that big. I could hear everything. Hello? His voice had changed, gotten softer somehow. Warmer. Then I heard it, a woman's voice, clear as day through the phone speaker. Honey, when are you coming home? The kids have been asking about you all week. Kids. Frank and I never had children. We'd tried for years, gone through all the tests, all the treatments. It had been the great sadness of our marriage, the empty space we'd learned to work around. But this woman was talking about kids like they were his kids. I know, sweetheart, Frank was saying in a voice I barely recognized. Probably Friday night. Tell them Daddy's working hard to take care of them. Daddy. The word hit me like a physical blow. I set down my fork and stared at the meatloaf cooling on my plate, trying to process what I was hearing. Love you too, Frank said quietly. Give everyone my love. When he came back to the table, his expression was perfectly normal again. The same face I'd been looking at across dinner tables for 3 decades. Sorry about that, he said, picking up his fork like nothing had happened. Vendor problems. You know how it is. But I'd heard what I'd heard. A woman calling him honey. Kids asking when Daddy was coming home. A whole life existing somewhere else, somewhere I wasn't. Frank, I said carefully, who was that on the phone? Just business, Margaret. Nothing for you to worry about. The dismissal in his voice was so casual, so automatic, that I almost accepted it. Almost went back to eating my meatloaf and pretending I hadn't heard a woman who sounded like she was in love with my husband. Almost. Instead, I excused myself to get dessert from the kitchen and made a decision that would change everything. If Frank was going to Louisville this weekend for business, then maybe it was time I took a little trip myself. I'd never followed my husband anywhere in 30 years of marriage. I'd trusted him completely, believed every explanation, every late night, every business trip. But trust, I was learning, was a luxury I could no longer afford. When Friday came and Frank kissed me goodbye, telling me he'd be back Sunday night, I waited exactly 30 minutes. Then I threw some clothes in a bag, filled up my car with gas, and pointed toward the highway that led to Louisville. I had no idea what I was going to find there. I just knew that whatever it was going to be the truth. And after 30 years of living a lie I didn't even know I was living, the truth felt like the only thing worth chasing. What I saw in Lexington would destroy everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my husband, and my life. Would you follow your spouse on a suspicious trip? She kissed him like a wife welcoming her husband home from war. I sat in my car across the street, watching my marriage die. The house on Maple Street in Lexington was everything mine wasn't. Fresh white paint, flower boxes under every window, a tire swing hanging from the oak tree in the front yard. It looked like the kind of home you'd see in magazines, the kind Frank and I had dreamed about when we were young and still believed dreams came true. I'd been parked there for 2 hours, engine off, windows cracked just enough to hear the sounds of a neighborhood I didn't belong to. Kids riding bikes, dogs barking, the distant hum of lawn mowers. Normal life happening all around me while my world crumbled inside a Honda Civic with 150,000 miles on it. Then Frank's truck pulled into the driveway. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched him get out, stretch his back the way he always did after a long drive, and grab his overnight bag from the truck bed. The same bag he'd kissed me goodbye with that morning, telling me he'd miss me while he was gone. The front door opened before he reached it. She was younger than me, maybe 50, with auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail and paint-stained jeans that somehow looked elegant on her. When she saw Frank walking up the path, her whole face lit up like Christmas morning. That's when she kissed him. Not the quick peck on the cheek that old married couples give each other. This was the kind of kiss that said, "I've been waiting for you," the kind that made my stomach turn over with recognition because I remembered when Frank used to kiss me like that. A lifetime ago. Daddy. Daddy's home. The voice came from somewhere inside the house, high and excited. A little girl came running through the door, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with Frank's dark eyes and curly hair that bounced when she moved. Frank dropped his bag right there on the front walk and scooped her up, spinning her around while she giggled. The sound of that laugh cut through me like broken glass because it was pure joy, the kind of happiness that comes from a child who knows she's loved. Behind her came a boy, maybe 10, hanging back shyly until Frank set the girl down and opened his arms. Then he was running too, all knees and elbows and excitement, calling, "Dad," in a voice that was starting to crack with puberty. Dad. Daddy. The words I'd never heard applied to my husband in all our years together. The auburn-haired woman stood in the doorway watching this reunion, and the expression on her face was everything I'd lost and never even realized was gone. Love, yes, but more than that. Security. Belonging. The quiet confidence that comes from knowing your place in someone's world. I watched them go inside together, Frank's arm around the woman's waist, the children chattering and pulling at his free hand. Through the big picture window, I could see them settling into what looked like their evening routine. Frank in a recliner that matched the one he had at home, the woman bringing him a beer, the kids curled up on either side of him while he helped with homework. The perfect family. The life he'd built while I was back in Cincinnati, heating up leftovers and wondering why he seemed so tired all the time. The truth hits hardest when you see it with your own eyes. Subscribe before you're blindsided. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the sun to start setting, long enough for the streetlights to flicker on, long enough for the neighbors to start looking curiously at the strange car parked across from the perfect house on Maple Street. When I finally started my engine, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. But as I pulled away from that curb, I caught one more glimpse through the window. They were sitting around a dining room table, the four of them, sharing dinner and conversation and the easy intimacy of people who belong together. Frank was laughing at something the boy had said, reaching over to ruffle his hair with the same gentle affection I remembered from our early years. But it was the little girl who broke me completely. As my headlights swept across the window, she looked up from her plate and I saw her face clearly for the first time. She had Frank's eyes, yes. But she also had something else, something that made my breath catch in my throat. She had my father's chin. The same stubborn Mackenzie jawline that I'd inherited, that had been passed down through generations of my family. How would you react to seeing your spouse's secret family? The estate attorney looked at my copies without flinching. Then she said words that changed everything: "This is criminal fraud." Her name was Patricia Holbrook, and I'd found her through the yellow pages at a gas station halfway between Lexington and Cincinnati. I'd been driving around for hours after leaving Maple Street, too shocked to go home, too angry to think straight. When I finally pulled into that Texaco station, my hands were still trembling from what I'd witnessed. I called her office from the payphone next to the air pump. "I need to see a lawyer," I told her secretary. "It's about forged documents and stolen money." "Mrs. Holbrook can see you tomorrow at 10, came the crisp reply. That night, I didn't go home. I checked into a roadside motel and spread all my photocopied documents across the scratchy bedspread, trying to make sense of the puzzle Frank had been building around me for years. Every bank statement, every signature that didn't look quite right, every insurance policy that had my name but not my knowledge. By morning, I had questions. Patricia Holbrook had answers. Her office was in downtown Columbus, 3 floors up in one of those old brick buildings that had been converted for lawyers and accountants. She was maybe 60, with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When I walked in carrying my manila folder of evidence, she looked like she'd seen this story before. "Tell me what you found," she said simply. I spread the documents across her mahogany desk and watched her face as she went through them. The forged signatures, the mysterious bank transfers, the insurance policies with names I didn't recognize. She picked up each piece of paper, studied it carefully, then set it aside without comment. "This marriage certificate," she said finally, holding up the document that had nearly stopped my heart. "When did you first see this?" 3 days ago. Hidden in my husband's desk." She nodded and picked up another paper. "And these property deeds for the Kentucky house. Your signature is on them, but you never signed them?" "Never even knew the house existed until yesterday." Patricia leaned back in her leather chair and studied me over her glasses. "Mrs. Stewart, I've been practicing estate law for 35 years. I've seen a lot of creative approaches to asset manipulation. But what your husband has done here is beyond creative. This is systematic, long-term fraud." The word hung in the air between us like a verdict. "Criminal fraud," she continued. "Multiple felonies across state lines. Identity theft, forgery, bigamy if that marriage certificate is legitimate. We're talking federal charges." I felt something shift inside me then, like a door opening that had been locked for years. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone was taking my side, someone was saying that what had been done to me was wrong. "Can you help me?" I asked. She smiled, and it wasn't a gentle smile. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed a good fight. "Mrs. Stewart, I specialize in cases exactly like this. And I know someone who can pull records that aren't supposed to exist anymore. When did you last check that your legal documents say what you think they say?" The retired clerk whispered, "Honey, I've seen this before. Men who know the system know how to work it." Then she pulled out files I thought were destroyed. Patricia had made one phone call after I left her office, and by Thursday morning we were sitting in Dolores Hamrick's kitchen in a subdivision outside Columbus. Dolores had worked in the county courthouse for 43 years before retiring, and according to Patricia, She had a memory like a steel trap and a filing system that would make the FBI jealous. I never threw anything away, Dolores explained, pouring coffee from a pot that looked older than I was. Official policy said destroy records after 7 years, but I always kept copies. Call it insurance. She was a tiny woman, maybe 75, with white hair and hands that shook slightly when she lifted her cup. But her eyes were sharp as she looked over the documents I'd brought. Franklin Stewart, she said slowly. Oh yes, I remember him. Charming man. Always very polite, always brought me flowers from his hardware store. Said they were from his greenhouse out back. My throat tightened. Frank had never grown flowers. Claimed he was allergic to most plants, couldn't even keep a houseplant alive. But apparently he'd been bringing flowers to courthouse employees for years. He came in regular, Dolores continued. Always had some document that needed to be filed, always seemed to know exactly which forms to use. Most folks get confused by all the paperwork, but not him. He knew the system better than some of the lawyers. She disappeared into what had once been a dining room but now served as her personal archive. Floor-to-ceiling filing cabinets lined every wall, each drawer labeled in the same neat handwriting. When she came back, she was carrying a box. Property transfers, she said, setting it on the kitchen table. Some of these go back 15 years. Your husband was very busy, honey. The first file she pulled out made my coffee cup rattle against the saucer. My father's farm deed, the one that should have passed to me when he died 5 years ago. But this version was different from the one in our family safe. This one showed the property being transferred to Franklin Stewart 6 months before my father's death. Daddy never would have signed this, I whispered, staring at the shaky signature that was supposed to be his. He was barely conscious those last months. The cancer had spread to his brain. That's what I thought at the time, Dolores said quietly. I remember when your husband brought this in. Said your father wanted to make sure there wouldn't be any legal complications after he passed. Very thoughtful, he said. Very forward-thinking. She pulled out another file, then another. Years of documents I'd never seen, never approved, never even knew existed. Property transfers, bank authorizations, insurance beneficiary changes. All with my forged signature, all filed properly and legally, all completely unknown to me. The system works on trust, Dolores explained. We assume that when someone brings in a notarized document, it's legitimate. We're not handwriting experts. We just process the paperwork. But you kept copies of everything? She nodded. Something about the whole thing felt wrong. Your father's signature looked off. And the timing bothered me. But I didn't have any proof, just a feeling. Now we have proof, Patricia said grimly. But it was the last document in the box that made my world tilt completely sideways. My father's will, filed 6 months after his funeral. The official version that left everything to James Mackenzie's closest living relative. Except I wasn't named anywhere in it. According to the will on file, James Mackenzie had no daughters, no family except his son-in-law Franklin Stewart. Comment, fraud, if you think forging a dying man's signature crosses every line. I knew my father's signature better than my own. The one on that deed was close, but the J in James curled the wrong way. Back in Dolores's kitchen, surrounded by boxes of evidence that painted my husband as a methodical thief, I held up the forged deed and felt 30 years of trust crumble into dust. My father had taught me to write by guiding my small hand with his big one, showing me how each letter should look, how the J in James should curl back on itself like a shepherd's crook. He always said his signature was like a thumbprint, I told Patricia and Dolores. Impossible to fake because of that little curl. But Frank had tried anyway. The signature was good, I'll give him that. The right size, the right slant, most of the letters perfect. But that J curled forward instead of back, like someone had learned the motion from watching rather than feeling. How long had this been going on? I asked Dolores. She pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. First document I can find is from 1995. A power of attorney giving your husband the right to handle your father's affairs if he became incapacitated. 2 years before my father's first cancer diagnosis. Frank had been planning this for longer than I could imagine. The cancer gave him the perfect excuse, Patricia said grimly. Sick man, devoted son-in-law helping out with the paperwork. Who would question it? I thought about all those hospital visits, all the times Frank had volunteered to handle the legal details so I could focus on caring for Daddy. I'd been grateful for his help, touched by how much he seemed to care about my family's welfare. Now I could see it for what it really was, research. Learning my father's handwriting, understanding his financial situation, figuring out exactly what needed to be stolen and how to do it legally. The farm was just the beginning, Dolores continued, pulling out deed after deed. Once he had power of attorney, he started transferring everything. The savings account, the CD that was supposed to pay for your father's funeral, even the mineral rights to the back 40 acres. Family inheritances disappear through paperwork daily. Subscribe to protect what's rightfully yours. I'd wondered why Daddy's funeral had been so expensive, why we'd had to take out a loan to cover the costs. Frank had handled all the arrangements, said Daddy's savings weren't as much as we'd hoped. I'd never questioned it, too buried in grief to worry about money. There's more, Patricia said softly, opening another file. The life insurance policy your father took out when you were born. The one that was supposed to ensure you'd always have something to fall back on. The beneficiary form showed my name crossed out and replaced with Franklin Stewart. My signature was at the bottom, authorizing the change. Except I'd never seen that form before in my life. $40,000, I whispered, staring at the payout amount. That's what Frank used to expand the hardware store. He told me it was a business loan. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture so ugly I could barely look at it. While I was grieving my father's death, Frank had been systematically looting his estate. Every document, every signature, every legal transfer had been carefully planned and expertly executed. He studied the system, Dolores said. Knew exactly which forms to file, exactly how to make it look legitimate. Most people never check the courthouse records for their own property. They trust that their family wouldn't steal from them. Trust. That word again. The foundation of every relationship, the assumption that people you love won't destroy you for money. So what happens now? I asked. Patricia gathered the documents into neat piles. Now we file charges. Multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and identity theft. Plus we start the process of getting your inheritance back. But it was the will that haunted me most. According to the official document on file at the courthouse, my father had died believing he had no daughter. That Frank had made sure I was erased from the last legal record of our relationship. Some betrayals go deeper than money. Some cut all the way to the bone. What's the worst betrayal involving family inheritance you've heard? I told him I was visiting my sister. Instead, I parked outside the Kentucky house and counted the lies. Friday morning came with the kind of spring rain that makes everything look fresh and new. Frank kissed me goodbye at the kitchen door, told me to give my sister his love, and reminded me to drive careful on those wet roads. I smiled and nodded and promised to call when I got there safely. Then I drove straight to Lexington. This time, I came prepared. Thermos of coffee, sandwiches, notebook, camera with a telephoto lens I'd bought at the pawn shop. I parked 3 houses down from the White House on Maple Street, close enough to see but far enough away to blend in with the other cars lining the residential street. The routine started early. 7:15, the auburn-haired woman came out to get the newspaper, wearing a bathrobe I recognized from the Sears catalog. Same one I'd circled last Christmas, thinking Frank might get it for me. He'd said terry cloth wasn't practical. 7:30, the kids came tumbling out the front door with backpacks and lunchboxes, the boy on a bicycle that was too small for him, the girl walking with a friend who lived 2 houses over. Normal morning chaos, the kind Frank and I had never experienced but had always imagined we might someday. 8 o'clock, Frank appeared in the doorway in his work clothes, kissing the woman goodbye with the casual intimacy of people who'd done this dance 1,000 times before. She handed him a travel mug and a brown paper sack, and he drove away in the same truck he'd driven home to me for 30 years. I followed him. The hardware store was called Stewart and Family Home Center, tucked into a strip mall between a beauty salon and a tax preparation office. The sign out front showed two cartoon figures holding hands, a man and a woman surrounded by paint cans and garden tools. Underneath, in smaller letters, Frank and Carolyn Stewart, owners. Carolyn. So that was her name. The woman who'd stolen my husband and my identity was named Carolyn. I parked across the street and watched Frank unlock the front door, flip on the lights, and start his day in a business that apparently belonged to both of us but only one of us knew about it. Customers came and went, people who greeted him like an old friend, people who probably sent Christmas cards to Frank and Carolyn Stewart every year. At lunchtime, she showed up with a bag from the deli next door. They ate together in the back office, visible through the glass partition, talking and laughing like people who actually enjoyed each other's company. When she left, he walked her to her car and kissed her forehead exactly the way he kissed mine every morning. The same gesture, the same tenderness, distributed between two lives like he had love to spare. I made notes in my spiral notebook, trying to be methodical about documenting this double life. Times, locations, license plate numbers, anything that might be useful later. But mostly I just sat there, learning the rhythm of a life I'd never been part of. 3 o'clock. The kids came home from school, stopping by the store like it was routine. Frank gave them each a piece of candy from the jar by the register and helped the boy with what looked like a math worksheet. The girl sat on a stool behind the counter, coloring in a book while Frank waited on customers. They were a family. A real, functioning, happy family. 5:30, they all went home together in Frank's truck. I followed at a distance, watching them pull into the driveway of the house where I'd first seen my marriage die. Through the windows, I could see them moving around the kitchen, preparing dinner together, settling into their evening routine. Saturday was more of the same. Grocery shopping, yard work, a trip to the park where Frank pushed the little girl on the swings while the boy played basketball with kids his own age. Sunday they went to church, not First Methodist in Cincinnati, but a little white chapel on the outskirts of Lexington where Frank served as an usher and Carolyn sang in the choir. I watched him pass the collection plate with the same serious expression he wore at our church back home. Watched the children sit quietly in the pew, legs swinging, sharing a hymnal between them. Watched Carolyn's voice rise with the other sopranos in songs about faithfulness and love. The mailbox at the end of their driveway had both their names painted in careful script, Frank and Carolyn Stewart. But when I got close enough to peek through the front window while they were at church, the mortgage papers spread across their kitchen table had my signature at the bottom. Forged again. But this time, I was listed as co-signer for a house I'd never seen, a mortgage I'd never agreed to pay. How long would you watch before taking action? The life insurance policy was for $500,000. My death benefit was listed as deceased. I was apparently already dead on paper. Monday morning found me back in Patricia's office with 3 pages of surveillance notes and a growing understanding of just how deep Frank's deception went. But it was the insurance documents Dolores had found that made my blood run cold. He's been planning this for 15 years, Patricia said, spreading the policies across her desk like cards in a poker game where the house always wins. Look at the dates on these beneficiary changes. The first change was made in 2010, just after my 50th birthday. Frank had thrown me a surprise party that year, invited all our friends from church, even hired a photographer. We danced to The Way You Look Tonight, while everyone clapped and said we were the perfect couple. 2 weeks later, he'd filed paperwork declaring me deceased. How is that even legal? I asked, staring at the death certificate that bore my name and a date I clearly remembered living through. It's not, Patricia said grimly. But insurance companies process thousands of claims every year. If the paperwork looks official and comes through the right channels, they don't always verify everything independently. The death certificate was a masterpiece of forgery. Official state seal, proper signatures, even a cause of death listed as natural causes following extended illness. Frank had created an entire fictional narrative around my death, complete with a hospital stay I'd never had and a funeral I'd never attended. The beauty of it, Patricia continued, is that once you're declared dead for insurance purposes, you can't accidentally discover the policy changes. Dead people don't check their beneficiaries. But Frank hadn't stopped there. Over the next 5 years, he'd systematically transferred every policy, every benefit, every financial safeguard we'd built together. My life insurance became Carolyn's death benefit. My health insurance was transferred to cover Frank's Kentucky family. Even my Social Security benefits had been redirected through a series of legal maneuvers that would have made a tax attorney proud. They'd planned your erasure down to the insurance papers. Subscribe so you spot erasure before it's complete. He was methodical about it, Patricia said, pulling out a timeline she'd constructed from the documents. First he established the other identity, then he started transferring assets, then he began the legal erasure. By the time he was finished, Margaret Stewart had effectively ceased to exist in any official capacity. I thought about all the times over the past few years when I'd felt invisible, like I was fading somehow. The bank teller who couldn't find my account. The doctor's office that claimed they had no record of my insurance. The voting booth where my name wasn't on the rolls even though I'd been registered for 30 years. I'd blamed bureaucratic incompetence. Now I could see it was something much more sinister. If I was already dead in his files, I said slowly, what was stopping him from making it real? The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that was still burning. Patricia's expression was grim as she gathered the insurance papers into a neat stack. Nothing, she said finally. Absolutely nothing. That night, I bought 3 different locks for my bedroom door. Then I called my sister and told her I might be coming for that visit after all. Not for a weekend, but for however long it took to figure out how to come back from the dead. Comment, scared if this level of planning would terrify you. I rehearsed what I'd say 100 times. When the moment came, I said nothing, and watched him lie. Tuesday evening, Frank came home from the hardware store carrying flowers. Not from his imaginary greenhouse, but from the grocery store down the street, still had the price sticker on the cellophane wrapper. Daisies and baby's breath, the same arrangement he'd been bringing me for special occasions since we were newlyweds. What's this for? I asked, taking the bouquet but not reaching for a vase. Can't a man bring his wife flowers just because he loves her? He kissed my cheek, and I caught the scent of perfume that wasn't mine. Something floral and expensive, not the drugstore body spray I'd been wearing for 20 years. Over dinner, I tested him with casual questions, the way you might test ice before walking on it. How was Louisville last weekend? I asked, cutting into the pot roast I'd made exactly the way he liked it. Oh, you know. Same old business meetings. Pretty boring stuff. He didn't look up from his plate, but I saw his shoulders tense slightly. Why do you ask? Just curious. You seemed tired when you got back. Long drive. You know how I hate being away from you. The lie came so smoothly, so naturally, that I almost believed it myself. Almost. I'd planned to confront him directly, to lay out all the evidence I'd gathered and demand explanations. But sitting across from him at our kitchen table, watching him lie with the same face that had pledged to love and cherish me 30 years ago, I realized something important. He was better at this game than I was. 30 years better. If I showed my hand too early, he'd find a way to turn it around, make me the crazy one, the forgetful wife who was imagining things again. How's the business doing? I asked instead. Pretty good. That new inventory system I told you about is really helping. Another lie, smooth as butter. There was no new inventory system. There was just a secret family and a stolen life I was paying for without knowing it. That's wonderful, honey. I'm so proud of how hard you work. He looked up then, probably surprised by the praise. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face, guilt, maybe, or relief that I wasn't asking harder questions. You're the best wife a man could ask for, Margaret. I hope you know that. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I smiled and served him more potatoes and watched him eat food bought with money stolen from my father's grave. After dinner, while Frank watched television in his recliner, I sat in the kitchen making a grocery list. But I wasn't writing down milk and bread. I was writing down every lie he'd told me, every smooth explanation, every casual dismissal of my questions. He looked me in the eyes and said, "I love you more than life itself." I smiled and said, "I know." Inside, I was already 10 moves ahead, planning the chess match that would decide whether Margaret Stewart continued to exist or disappeared forever. Would you confront immediately or gather more ammunition? The process server found him at the hardware store. He called me crying, asking what he'd done wrong. I told him to read the papers. Thursday morning at 10:30, Patricia's process server walked into Stewart and Family Home Center and asked for Franklin James Stewart. I wasn't there to see it happen, but Dolores had a friend who worked at the beauty salon next door, and news travels fast in strip mall parking lots. According to the eyewitness report I got later, Frank was helping an elderly customer choose between paint samples when the server approached. Nice and professional, no drama, just handed over the legal documents and asked Frank to acknowledge receipt. Frank's face went white as he read the first page. Divorce proceedings. Fraud charges. Asset recovery lawsuit. The customer he'd been helping took one look at his expression and quietly backed away toward the door. My phone started ringing 20 minutes later. "Margaret, honey, what's going on?" Frank's voice was shaking, higher pitched than I'd ever heard it. "There's been some kind of mistake. Some crazy legal papers." "No mistake," I said calmly, stirring my coffee with the same spoon I'd used every morning for 30 years. "Read the papers, Frank. All of them. But I don't understand. Fraud charges? What fraud? Margaret, talk to me. We can work this out." It was almost funny, hearing the panic in his voice. For 30 years, Frank had been the one with all the answers, the one who handled everything, the one who told me not to worry my pretty little head about complicated matters. Now he was the one who didn't understand, the one who needed explanations. The life insurance policies, Frank. The ones where I'm listed as deceased. I kept my voice level, matter of fact. The property deeds with my forged signature. My father's stolen inheritance. Should I go on? Silence on the other end of the line. I could hear customers talking in the background, normal people going about their normal Thursday, buying normal things from a man whose world was falling apart. "Margaret, I can explain everything. Just give me a chance. I've been giving you chances for 30 years. Time's up." I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the same walls and furniture and memories that had defined my life for 3 decades. But everything felt different now. The air was cleaner somehow, like a window had been opened after years of staleness. The phone rang again. I didn't answer. It rang 4 more times over the next hour. Each time, I let the answering machine pick up, listening to Frank's increasingly desperate messages. Promises to explain everything, pleas for understanding, threats disguised as concern about my mental health. At noon, Patricia called. "The papers have been served," she said. "How are you holding up?" "Better than expected." "What happens next?" "Now we wait to see how he responds. The fraud charges are already filed with the prosecutor's office. 2 states, federal jurisdiction because of the interstate activity. This isn't going away quietly." Through my kitchen window, I could see Mrs. Henderson from church walking her little dog past our house. She slowed down as she approached, probably hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever drama was unfolding behind our respectable front door. The same woman who'd whispered about me in the fellowship hall was now trying to spy on me from the sidewalk. Justice served publicly hits different. Agree or disagree? By evening, Frank still hadn't come home. I made myself dinner for one, watched the news, went to bed in a room that felt bigger without his presence. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking up wondering what secret life was happening while I dreamed. The fraud charges were filed the same day. 2 states, federal jurisdiction. His hardware store customers started asking questions about the police cars that had been seen in the parking lot, about the process server, about whether Frank Stewart was really the man they thought they knew. Justice served publicly hits different. Agree or disagree? She called me crying. I didn't know about you, she sobbed. I thought I was his only wife. I was sitting in my kitchen 3 days after Frank had been served with papers, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The phone rang, and I almost didn't answer it. The number was from Kentucky, and I figured it was probably Frank calling from jail to make excuses or beg for forgiveness. Instead, I heard a woman's voice breaking apart with tears. Is this Margaret Stewart? Yes, I said carefully. My name is Carolyn Mackenzie. I think we need to talk. Carolyn Mackenzie. The name from all those forged documents. The bride on that marriage certificate that had nearly stopped my heart. The woman Frank had been calling sweetheart while eating my meatloaf. I know who you are, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. She let out a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. I just found out about you yesterday. A detective came to my door asking questions about Frank, about our marriage, about documents with your signature on them. I didn't understand what he was talking about until he showed me copies of papers I'd never seen before. I waited, not sure what I was supposed to feel. Anger? Sympathy? This woman had been living with my husband for years, raising children he'd never told me about, sharing a bed in a house I'd helped pay for without knowing it. I thought I was his first wife, she continued. He told me he'd been married before, but that his wife had died years ago. Cancer, he said. He even showed me a death certificate with your name on it. A death certificate. Frank had killed me on paper completely, wiped me out of existence so thoroughly that he could remarry without anyone asking uncomfortable questions. How long? I asked. 17 years. We've been married 17 years. We have 3 children together. Sarah's 15, Michael's 12, and little Jamie just turned 8. Children. Frank had children, grandchildren I'd never met, never even knew existed. While I'd been grieving our childless marriage, he'd been raising a family in another state. Carolyn, I said, testing her name on my tongue. Did you know about the money? The transfers from our accounts? What transfers? Her voice got smaller. Frank always handled our finances. Said I didn't need to worry about where the money came from, just that there was always enough for the house payment and the kids' needs. Just like he'd done with me. Taking control, keeping secrets, making decisions that affected our lives without bothering to include us in them. I have copies of bank statements showing thousands of dollars moved from my accounts to yours every month for years, I said. Money from my inheritance, my father's farm, our joint savings. The silence stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. Then she whispered, he stole from you to take care of us. It wasn't a question. She understood what Frank had done, how he'd played us against each other without either of us knowing the game existed. Carolyn, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you have access to Frank's papers? His files, his desk, anything he keeps locked away? Yes, she said slowly. There's a filing cabinet in our basement. He told me never to go through it, but after what that detective showed me. I think we need to meet, I said. I have documents that prove Frank forged my signature on papers related to your house, your accounts, even your marriage certificate. And I think you might have documents that could help me understand just how deep this goes. There was another long pause. Then Carolyn said something that surprised me. I'm scared, Margaret. If he lied about you being dead, if he stole money to support us, what else has he done? What else don't I know? I don't know, I admitted. But I think we're going to find out together. We arranged to meet the next day at a diner halfway between Cincinnati and Lexington. 2 women who'd been married to the same man, both of us discovering that our entire lives had been built on lies. As I hung up the phone, I realized something had shifted inside me. For weeks, I'd been thinking of Carolyn as the other woman, the intruder who'd stolen my husband. But she wasn't the enemy. She was another victim, just like me. Frank was the enemy. And now he had 2 wives working against him instead of 1. Could you partner with your husband's other wife for justice? The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. Bigamy and fraud, the prosecutor announced. Multiple victims across state lines. 6 months after that first phone call with Carolyn, I was standing outside the Hamilton County Courthouse watching Frank's carefully constructed world collapse in front of news cameras and curious onlookers. The morning was crisp and clear, one of those October days when the air feels like possibility itself. Carolyn stood beside me, her hand gripping mine with a strength I'd never expected from the trembling woman I'd first met at that highway diner. We'd spent months working together, sharing documents, comparing stories, building a case that even Frank's expensive lawyer couldn't argue away. The prosecutor was a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Torres who'd taken one look at our evidence and called it the most systematic case of marriage fraud she'd seen in 15 years of practice. The defendant, Franklin James Stewart, engaged in a pattern of criminal behavior spanning multiple decades and multiple states, she announced to the gathered media. He contracted bigamous marriages, forged legal documents, committed identity theft, and defrauded financial institutions while maintaining elaborate deceptions that victimized multiple women and children. I watched the reporters scribble notes and adjust their cameras, documenting the downfall of a man who'd seemed so ordinary, so trustworthy, so completely normal that no one had ever suspected the scope of his lies. Frank always said he hated being the center of attention, Carolyn whispered to me. Guess he's getting plenty of it now. Through the courthouse windows, I could see Frank sitting at the defendant's table in his best suit, the same one he'd worn to church every Sunday for years. His lawyer was whispering urgently in his ear, but Frank just stared straight ahead like he was watching his own execution. The charges were extensive enough to make my head spin. Federal mail fraud for using the postal system to transfer forged documents across state lines. Identity theft for using my father's information to transfer the farm deed. Bigamy in 2 states. Bank fraud for the forged signatures on loan applications. Insurance fraud for the policies he'd taken out in false names. The financial impact on the victims exceeds $400,000, the prosecutor continued. This includes stolen inheritance funds, fraudulent property transfers, and systematic theft of marital assets over a period of nearly 2 decades. $400,000. I'd known Frank had been stealing from me, but hearing the number spoken out loud in front of all these strangers made it feel real in a way the bank statements never had. The church ladies from First Methodist were there too, clustered together near the courthouse entrance like a flock of concerned birds. Mrs. Henderson caught my eye and nodded, a gesture that felt like an apology for all those months of whispered conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. Betty Williams actually walked over during a break in the proceedings. "Margaret, honey, I want you to know we tried to warn you," she said, twisting her purse strap around her fingers. "But how do you tell someone their husband is living a double life? How do you even start that conversation?" "You did warn me," I said. "Those whispers in the fellowship hall, the way you all went quiet when I walked in. I heard what you were trying to tell me. It just took me a while to listen." When the judge finally called the court to order for sentencing, Frank's lawyer made one last attempt at mercy. "Your Honor, my client is a man who made mistakes, but he's not a career criminal. He's a respected businessman with ties to the community." "He's a predator," the judge interrupted. "He preyed on the trust of women who loved him, stealing not just their money but their sense of reality itself." The sentence was 12 years in federal prison, full restitution to all victims, and forfeiture of any assets obtained through fraud. As they led Frank away in handcuffs, he turned back and looked at me one last time. I expected anger, or pleading, or some final attempt at manipulation. Instead, he just looked tired. Like keeping up all those lies had finally worn him down to nothing. The judge ordered full restitution. The farm, the insurance, the savings, everything back where it belonged. But the personal cost would take years to heal. What would you want him to lose most, money, reputation, or freedom? The church ladies who once whispered about me now whisper with me about other women who might need help spotting the signs. 2 years later, I was sitting in that same fellowship hall where this whole nightmare had started, but everything was different now. The whispers were still there, but now I was part of them instead of being the subject of them. "I'm worried about Linda Morrison," Mrs. Henderson was saying as she arranged cookies on a paper plate. "Her husband's been taking a lot of business trips lately, and she seems so lost." Betty Williams nodded knowingly. "Same pattern. Always the same pattern with these men. They isolate first, then they start moving money around." I looked up from the newsletter I was folding. "Has anyone talked to her directly?" "Well, you know how it is," Mrs. Henderson said. "You can't just walk up to someone and tell them their marriage might be a lie." "Actually," I said, "you can. It's not comfortable, and it's not easy, but sometimes it's the kindest thing you can do." That had become my role in our little church community, the woman who'd survived the unthinkable and lived to help others spot the warning signs. Pastor Williams had even asked me to speak at a women's retreat about financial awareness in marriage, though I'd turned him down. I wasn't ready to be that public with my story yet. But one-on-one conversations over coffee? Those I could handle. My life had changed in ways I never could have imagined. The farm was mine again, legally and completely, with clear title and no forged signatures anywhere in the paperwork. Frank's lawyer had tried to argue that the property transfers were legitimate, but Judge Martinez had taken one look at the handwriting analysis and ordered immediate reversion of ownership. I'd moved back to the farmhouse where I'd grown up, the place Frank had stolen from me and tried to sell without my knowledge. It needed work, the roof had some leaks, the kitchen was 40 years out of date, and the barn needed new paint, but it was home in a way nowhere else had ever been. Carolyn and I talked every few weeks now. She'd kept the house in Lexington, the one Frank had bought with my money, but Judge Martinez had ruled that since the funds were stolen, she could stay as long as she made payments directly to me for the remaining mortgage balance. It was unconventional, but it worked. Her kids were adjusting slowly to the truth about their father. Sarah, the oldest, was angry at everyone, at Frank for lying, at Carolyn for not knowing, at me for existing. Michael just seemed confused most of the time. Little Jamie, bless her heart, had asked if I was her grandmother now since Frank was my husband too. "I don't know what we are to each other," I'd told her honestly during one of our phone calls. "But we're family somehow. Family that Frank tried to keep secret, but family all the same." The money Frank had stolen was slowly being returned through restitution payments and asset seizures, though I'd probably never see all of it again. That was fine. What mattered more was that I'd learned to manage my own finances, read my own bank statements, and ask questions when something didn't make sense. I kept Frank's forged copy of my father's signature in my Bible as a bookmark, pressed between the pages of Psalm 37, "The wicked plot against the righteous and gnash their teeth at them, but the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he knows their day is coming." Not for revenge, I'd moved past wanting to punish Frank. The federal prison system was handling that just fine without any help from me. I kept it as a reminder that lies have a shelf life, that truth has its own handwriting, and that even the most careful deception eventually unravels when exposed to enough light. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd never overheard those church ladies whispering, if I'd never found that manila folder under Frank's recliner. Would I have lived the rest of my life never knowing about Carolyn and the children, never discovering that half my inheritance had been stolen, never learning that I'd been declared dead on paper while still breathing? Probably. But I'd also never have learned that I was stronger than I thought, braver than I knew, and capable of rebuilding a life from scratch at 67 years old. The whispers in the fellowship hall continued around me as I finished folding the last newsletter. Women looking out for other women, sharing information and concern in the way women have always done when the official channels fail them. I smiled and reached for another cookie. Some whispers, I'd learned, were worth listening to. What's the most important lesson about trust you've learned the hard way?